Today, we're going to talk about a case that took more than 20 years to solve. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. In the summer of 1990, Jennifer Schuett was living in Dickinson, Texas. She had just finished the second grade, and Jennifer was just this loving, full-of-life child who loved to learn. She loved school. Jennifer would go on to say that she was terrified of the dark and would try to sleep in her mom's room as many nights as she could. But one night during that summer, Jennifer had went into her mother's room, got in bed, and fallen asleep. But that night, Jennifer had been pretty restless. Her mom turned to her and said, "Jennifer, you keep kicking me in your sleep, and I really have to get up early to go to work tomorrow. Would you mind just sleeping in your own bed tonight?" And she would turn to her mom and say, "Just because I love you, Mom, I'm gonna sleep in my own bed." So Jennifer left her mother's room and made her way to her own room. And the first thing she did when she got there was flip on a lamp. This lamp was shaped like a ginormous light bulb, and she remembered that it just lit up the entire room. And then she got some books and she just read until she fell asleep. The next thing she remembers is waking up in the arms of a man that she did not know who was running down a sidewalk. And obviously he's holding her really tightly, and she goes to scream and he instantly puts his hand over her mouth and nose so she couldn't make a sound. And then he jumps in his car, puts Jennifer on his lap, and begins to drive away. And the entire time he's driving, he's trying to calm Jennifer down. He's saying, "I'm an undercover police officer. It's okay. Everything's fine. You're safe with me." And Jennifer would go on to say that as a child, she wanted to believe him. But the other part of her was really terrified of the dark, and school had warned her about talking to strangers. So she felt really uncomfortable and pretty frightened by the situation. And as they were driving, the light bulb went off in Jennifer's head. She had been kidnapped. He pulled into her elementary school parking lot and sat there. He pointed up at the moon and told her to watch it because when it changed colors, her mom was going to come and pick her up. So Jennifer did what any child would do in that situation. She anxiously awaited the arrival of her mother to pick her up. And they waited and waited, and Jennifer kind of noted that she thought he was just kind of psyching himself up for what he really wanted to do to her. And then after a while, he said, "I guess your mother's not coming." He started the car, drove a few blocks away, and went to a dead-end gravel road. And she's listening to the gravel underneath the tires crunch, and she's terrified, and she's not sure what's happening, and it's dark, and she doesn't know this person. She is absolutely terrified at this point. And as they're creaking down that gravel dead-end road, he pulls into a field. He then pulled out a knife and held it to her throat and said, "Am I scaring you, little girl? Am I scaring you?" And then he lunged at her and began to choke her. Eventually, he tried to break her neck, and Jennifer just completely blacked out at this point. She would wake up to him pulling her by the ankles into the field. He then dropped her legs down and walk away. She would hear his car door slam, the car start, and him drive away. But Jennifer couldn't scream. She's an 8-year-old child. She has no idea what just happened. She's in a field. She's trying to scream for help. She's terrified. It's dark. And then she reaches with her right hand to her neck and realizes there's blood and a gaping wound. And when she looked at her hand, it was covered in her own blood. And this is an 8-year-old child viciously attacked after being kidnapped, dragged to a field, and left there to bleed out and die. So as time passes, Jennifer is going in and out of consciousness. She had her throat slit, so obviously she's bleeding out into this field. Not only could she not move her body, she couldn't lift her head, she couldn't scream, but ants had been crawling all over her and biting her. And every time she would come in and out of consciousness, she was completely amazed that she hadn't died yet. And as she's laying there, she's kind of looking through the blades of this tall grass, and she can see cars going by, but she couldn't move. She couldn't stand up, she couldn't scream, and she's just watching these cars go by, hoping that somebody somehow sees her. And I feel like that is so agonizing that help is just a few feet away, and yet here she lies suffering. And Jennifer would say in an interview that at that point she didn't feel scared. She had come to terms with what was happening and somewhat felt at peace. And for an 8-year-old to be in that position and to have to think that way is just truly heartbreaking. And then in those early morning hours, Jennifer's mother is obviously up. She realizes Jennifer is not in her bed, and sheer panic ensues. She calls 911. They're alerted that an 8-year-old child has been kidnapped from an apartment complex, and immediately the search begins. The police contact the fire department, and they get volunteers, and they start searching fields. And then Jennifer woke up again, and it was early evening. She could tell that the sun was starting to set, and it was starting to get dark outside again. But this time when she woke up, she heard children playing, and it sounded close to her. And then something hit her foot, and it was actually a child that had been playing tag in the field that tripped over her foot, and she had been found. Obviously, these children ran and got help, and at that time, Jennifer had gone unconscious again, and this time she woke up to a police officer kneeling down beside her. And he said to her, "You've been found. You're going to be okay. Just please stay with me. Please stay with me." I can't imagine what this officer was going through as he's kneeling down by this child whose throat has been cut open and she's bleeding and ants are crawling on her. And all he wants to do is get her to safety and to get her the help she desperately needs. And he's watching her drift in and out of consciousness, and he knows that time is limited, that they have to do something now. And the last time that Jennifer would come to, she was being placed into a helicopter. She was airlifted to a hospital, and the doctor, once he saw her, knew that her condition was grave. Her throat had been cut from ear to ear, and they assumed she had been sexually assaulted. And the cops and the doctors immediately thought, this is going to be a murder case. She's in grave condition. She is seriously injured. She's laid there pretty much all day, bleeding out. And when the doctor first saw her, he mentioned that she was so pale, just had no color in her. She had ant bites and bug bites all over her body. She had scratches on her back, but she couldn't make any sound due to the severity of the injury on her throat. But the amazing thing was, she was alert and she was awake. And the doctor said that when she looked at you, you knew that she was so fearful. You could see it in her eyes. And I can imagine that Jennifer didn't know who to trust at that point, because this man came into her bedroom and he claimed he was an undercover cop, and then he brutally assaulted her and left her for dead. So they kept trying to comfort her, and they're saying, "We're here for you. We're not going to hurt you. We're going to make you feel better. We're going to take care of you. We promise." The doctor found out that the cut went through her trachea, so they had to place in a tube below where they were doing the repair. She was very lucky that it didn't hit any major vessels. So they completed her surgery. They stabilized her. She was no longer bleeding, and they were hopeful that she would recover. And of course, police were on guard. They were put in front of her room. They wanted to make sure that nobody could get in there to harm her again. The ICU nurse on shift that night recalled just feeling so much heartache. She looked at this innocent child laying in this bed, and she couldn't imagine who would ever do something like this to a child. And really, all she did was sit with her. When she was sleeping, she was there. When she was awake, she was there. She wanted her to feel safe. Later on, the doctors did find out that Jennifer had been sexually assaulted. Jennifer was unconscious when it happened, and she didn't have a memory of it. And she went on to say that as an 8-year-old, she really couldn't comprehend it either way. It was very hard for her to understand and grasp. And Jennifer is obviously incredibly traumatized, but she can't vocalize this. So she does have male doctors, and they're coming in and out of her room, and it's terrifying her. She even kicked one, and this nurse just stayed there with her. She wanted her to feel safe. But obviously, police then are investigating this. So they go to the field, they're looking around, and they found clothes in a ditch, which they collected because they assumed they were Jennifer's, and hopefully they could get some DNA evidence off of the clothing. And obviously, police had to talk to Jennifer. There's an 8-year-old child who was abducted, sexually assaulted, and left for dead. They need to find the man that did this. But of course, she's traumatized. She had some serious trauma happen to her, and she doesn't know who she can trust. This man said he was a police officer. So bringing police officers into this room, of course, is more traumatizing. It's terrifying to this child. She can't talk. She can't tell them what happened. So Jennifer started writing notes to her mother, and her mother would actually go out and hand them to the police officer. And that night, Jennifer is in the hospital, and her mother's there, and this ICU nurse who's been there just kind of hanging out with her and comforting her are sitting together. And Jennifer's mom starts asking her questions. She was asking things like, do we know this person? What was he wearing? What did he look like? And she kept trying to remember all this stuff. And she did remember this man's name. She said he said his name is Dennis. She wrote that down on the paper and handed it to her mother. And she said that he looked greasy and that maybe he had a scar on his face. But the most incredible thing about this is she described his car to the letter. She knew the color. She knew that it had a dent in the side of the door. She knew that there were beer cans in the car. She wrote down the brand of cigarettes that were in his car. Every little detail that this 8-year-old child could remember, she wrote it down and gave it to her mother. And what's really incredible about this is the small details are so important to an investigation. A lot of survival videos will tell you if you've been abducted or somebody has kidnapped you to make note of everything. Say the license plate over and over again in your head. Look at the color of the car, the material, anything you can latch onto, those little details. They seem irrelevant, but they're so important. And this 8-year-old child managed to do that. She got all of these little details, and she's writing writing these notes to her mother, and they're adding up into this portfolio that the police are going to be able to use. So they did bring in a forensic artist to actually draw up a sketch of this man. So this woman came in and they're going through a book and they're looking at different eyes and noses, and she's asking Jennifer if anything looks familiar. So this woman is drawing as her and Jennifer are going through this book, and they're really working well as a team. Jennifer said that this woman just really understood her. And in an hour, they have a sketch of this person. And she flips over the picture and shows Jennifer, and Jennifer shook her head yes. Remember, she couldn't speak, and she just adamantly shaking her head. Even at 8 years old, she knew that if he wasn't caught, he was going to hurt somebody else. And she felt very confident that that picture resembled him. But then Jennifer had to eventually leave the hospital, and that was really hard for her because it became a safe place. She had cops outside her door. She had this nurse and her mother with her at all times. There's people around. It was busy. She could have all the lights on constantly and not be scared. And while she was in the hospital, she even began to regain her voice. And then shortly after this attack, she's home and she's gonna start school on time with the rest of her classmates. She was going into the 3rd grade, but police were at her school when she went because the community was just on edge. This didn't happen in this town. It was a close-knit, smaller town. Violent crime really wasn't something that they were concerned about. And then the years just kind of passed by. It was a cold case. They weren't getting as many leads. They really didn't know who had perpetrated this crime against Jennifer. They really just didn't have any idea how to find this person and how to close this case. And the whole time, this attack is in the back of Jennifer's mind. I mean, how could it not be? She was an 8-year-old when this happened, and she just had to move on with life, knowing that her attacker was out there and at any time could hurt her again. But life went on. She went to high school, she graduated, she went to college, and then she graduated and became a children's librarian at a local public library. And she loved that job, and she was so good at her job because she loved children and she wanted to keep children safe. And then about 18 years after her attack, she kind of was growing a little bit frustrated with the investigation. She's like, how could this possibly go cold? It's been 18 years. The case keeps getting handed off from person to person, and it kind of felt like she was always starting over. Somebody would pick it up and then the case would be open again and they'd have to start from the beginning, which happens with cold cases. But you can imagine how traumatizing it was every single time that happened. And then one day she gets a call from a detective named Tim, and he tells her, listen, I'm picking up your case. I'm really excited to meet you. I want to get this case closed. And he really was excited to get this done and taken care of. He really wanted to close this for her. But when he met with her, he really didn't anticipate her reaction. She was very frustrated. She got upset. She cried in his office. And although he didn't expect it, he did understand it. But the amazing thing about Jennifer was she was so concerned about other people becoming victims. That was her #1 priority, to find and catch this person who did it to her. She was so concerned about other children. And then he said something to her that changed her life. He said, I will do whatever I can in my power until the end of my career to get you the answers that you need for this case. And right then she knew that he was absolutely dedicated to this, that he was going to try to solve this no matter what. And then the next call she received was that of an FBI agent that Detective Tim had brought on board. They went on to say that this was one of the most violent crimes they have ever investigated where the victim had survived. And so they started submitting the evidence that had been in the evidence room. They wanted to see if they could get DNA off of it. They had Jennifer's t-shirt and underwear, but they also had a male's underwear and t-shirt. So they were sent to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia. And obviously it was an 18-year-old case at this point, so they knew that it was not going to be priority at the lab. And it took well over a year to get the DNA results back. I can't imagine what it's like waiting a year to find out if they had a suspect. And then at 2:30 a.m. in the morning, this FBI agent gets a phone call, and it's the DNA lab. And they said, we have a hit. And the name of this offender was Dennis Earl Bradford. And the FBI agent is like, who is this? We don't even know this person. They're not even on our suspect list. And so the FBI agent hangs up and he immediately calls Detective Tim and he's like, we have a hit. We have a suspect. Dennis Bradford had actually been convicted in 1997 for kidnapping in Arkansas. He was sent to prison, and it was from that sexual assault that his DNA was taken and put into the national database. And if you remember from the hospital, Jennifer had written a note to her mother letter that said, he said his name is Dennis. They knew his first name all along. And all these years later, it turns out that was the truth. His name was Dennis. And so obviously they dive in and they start investigating. They have his driver's license sent over, and when the detective and the agent open the email and see the image of him, they are absolutely flabbergasted. The image that Jennifer drew up with the specialist looked identical to his driver's license. And as I mentioned earlier, this is an 8-year-old child who was going through a traumatic event, and her accuracy on these little details was impeccable. His name, the way he looked, all matched up. And they said they've never seen an image so accurate. It looked like she was literally drawing the image from his driver's license. They were able to establish that Dennis had at least 2 addresses that were pretty close to Jennifer and her mom's apartment. So the DA authorizes charges, and then they traveled to North Little Rock. They talked to the police department, and they ended up pulling Dennis over for a traffic violation and arresting him. And that morning, they called Jennifer and they said, we got him. We've arrested him. And so Tim and the special agent for the FBI, they go and they meet this guy and they say he looked like a regular guy. He was a welder in Little Rock. He had 3 adult stepsons. He was married. By all accounts, he just seemed like an average person. And one of the detectives says, hey, I heard you're a pretty good welder. And Dennis, who was smiling at the time, said, you guys done your homework? And so they keep questioning him, and they ask Dennis if he's ever heard of Jennifer. And he says yes. And they said, did you ever come in contact with her? And he says yes. And they ask, can you tell me about that? And he just simply says no. And the detective would go on to say the way he said no just sent chills up his spine. He knew this was the person. The DNA matched, but he just had that sense, that one word, no, and he just knew. So the detective asked him, is there a reason why? Meaning, is there a reason why you don't want to talk about Jennifer? And Dennis said, you did your homework. And that is such a cold and deliberate answer. The detective goes, you're right, we did do our homework. And he said, if you're remorseful about this, people need to hear your story, and there's always 2 sides to every story. And they're really trying to convince him to just confess to this crime. They know he did it. And he said, you need to provide all the details from that night. Tell us about the attack so Jennifer can have closure. After all of these years, just give her closure. And he said to them, not a single day goes by where I don't see that baby. There is no other side to the story. She was an innocent, and I was a sick, deranged, beat up little fucking punk. And the detective would go on to say that it was a very long and exhausting interview. Dennis would tell them that he didn't know Jennifer, and he really didn't even know why he pulled up to those apartments in the first place. He said he was just driving around and he randomly pulled in there. And then he would go on to say that he just wants the entire thing to be over with, that he's tired of looking over his shoulder and being afraid. And he would go on to detail what happened that night. He said, okay, forgive me, mama. I pulled that little girl out of that window and I put her in my car. She was freaking out and I told her, please just don't worry. It'll be all right. I told that little girl that I was a police officer and everything would be okay. I pulled off on this little road, and that little girl, she was so scared. I just lost it. I was like a savaged animal. He said, I can't force myself to say it. And the detective said, this has been haunting me your whole life, Dennis. Just get it out. I took that little girl out there and I raped her and I cut her throat. I don't know why. I've never known why. Many, many times I've wanted to just end it, but I never had the guts. And then he mentioned to detectives shortly after the attack, he tried to commit suicide. He took a shotgun and he turned it on himself. He pulled the trigger and literally shot a hole through his father's roof. And then after that interview, they took him to the psychiatric ward in the hospital, which had actually been the same hospital that Jennifer was in after her attack. And so Jennifer begins her victim impact statement. She's ready for trial. They have a solid case. She wants to see this end. She is ready for the closure she deserved all of those years ago. And Detective Tim would wake up to a phone call one night. Dennis had been waiting in the county jail for his trial, and during that time, he actually hung himself in his jail cell. And so they didn't want Jennifer to be surprised by what happened. They didn't know if it was going to be in the news right away, so they called her that night and told her. And I'm sure this was absolutely heartbreaking. She had waited 20 some odd years to bring this to a close, to get closure, to see him face to face, to read her victim impact statement. And all of that was gone. And Jennifer had told them when they called to say, hey, we arrested him. She said, please don't let him kill himself. That was the first thing she said to them. So her disappointment was probably just overwhelming. And then on August 10th, 2010, Jennifer went to Dennis's grave 20 years to the day that she was attacked. And she read her victim impact statement to him. And she turned to her husband after reading the statement and she said, "I wonder if he can hear me." And just then, a single fire ant bit her on her leg. And she took that as a sign that he could hear it loud and clear. And then 22 years after the attack, Jennifer and her husband were expecting their first child. And it really feels like finally Jennifer can just breathe and enjoy her life. She had to go all of her life not knowing who did this to her and if they could come back and hurt her. And now that the case is closed and her life is going really well, she's actually an advocate for other survivors. And she really does remain close to all of those people that helped her through this. And this story just really touched me because she went through such a traumatic event and spent all of those years terrified, but was eventually able to find out and get a confession from the man that did this to her. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. See you next time.